To look at the future, we usually study the past, looking throughout history to see if we can decipher clues of what might come next. Futurists also rely on intuition and common sense. Let's lay a little groundwork first. Most of us are familiar with Moore's Law, especially since we've seen the changes in computing that's happened in a relatively short amount of time. When we talk about Moore's Law, we're talking about the trend of doubling the speed and capability of computers. Remember when? We got our first computer in 1985. It had a hard drive that had only 20 megabytes of memory, which the salesman at the time said that's more than you'll ever need. Today you can buy a 1 gig flash drive for a couple of dollars, which is 50 times the amount of memory that was in that entire machine. Not to mention, you can buy a Raspberry Pi for under $30 and build a computer yourself. This law is not actually a law at all, but rather an observation and a projection of the trend in this rate of increasing computer power. That the number of transistors per square inch on integrated circuits double, while almost at the same time that the speed increases, the costs are halved. This increase in computing power and reduction in size has had an impact on the size of our devices and how we use them. From the gigantic supercomputers that took up entire rooms or floors, to desktop computers, to handheld tablets and smartphones, and now wearable devices. We are growing not only more comfortable with our devices being mobile, ubiquitous, and performing in real time, but we take it for granted and just expect things to work that way. When we talk about the exponential growth of technology, we really need to move beyond talking about Moore's Law and discuss the accelerating pace of change of technology, which means also considering the growth in related fields such as communications. This accelerating pace of change has been referred to as the law of accelerating returns. By the way, it's important to note that this is not a predictive model either. This trend is describing the past. Don't worry, we'll get to a bit about predictions later on. This term was first coined by Ray Kurzweil. If you're not familiar with the name, he's the co-founder of the Singularity University, author of The Singularity is Near, When Humans Transcend Biology, and a director of engineering at Google. If none of those ring a bell, you might be familiar with his OCR technology or electronic keyboard. He is an accomplished inventor, and PBS has included Kurzweil as one of the 16 revolutionaries who made America, along with other inventors of the past 2 centuries. He's not the only futurist to refer to the technological singularity, but he is the one that has popularized the term. This term generally refers to what will happen after the birth of AI, or specifically when AI surpasses human intelligence. What this means in practical terms is that what we consider to be the core building blocks of society, money, government, family, will be so drastically different from what has come before to make society virtually unrecognizable. For example, looking at what life was like during medieval times, we would consider society functions completely different today. However, if you took a person from that time period and let's say they were able to time travel and land up in Times Square today, after they freaked out a little bit, they would still be able to understand that they could eat at a restaurant, they could use credit cards or cash to purchase food, and that the cost of food would be taxed by the government. This all sounds pretty fantastic, but whether they're right or wrong, there's no arguing that new discoveries are being made every single day, and our technology is increasingly affecting society and culture. According to Ray, the singularity will happen around the year 2029, so stay tuned. Okay, so before we step away from the fringe, I just want to mention a few more things. And by the way, this quote is from Amy Webb. Amy is the CEO of the Future Today Institute and a professor of strategic foresight at NYU's Stern School of Business. She's one of the leaders in researching and predicting technology trends, and we'll be taking a look at the current FTI report in a few. That quote goes hand in hand with this one by William Gibson. William Gibson is one of the most influential science fiction writers of our time. His works have explored the effects of technology, cybernetics, and computer networks on humanity and created an iconography for the information age before the coming age of the World Wide Web in the 90s. You might recall his most notable term that he coined, cyberspace, in the 90s that people used to refer to the World Wide Web, but he's had many others. He is known for his descriptive phrases that capture the mood around technology and his prescient understanding of its impact on society. Speaking of science fiction, we have to acknowledge its power to inspire those who create our future or work to invent it. From the Jetsons to a collection of French futurism postcards from the 1890s, some of the scenes depicted here are really not that far out or have already happened. To authors like Jules Verne, who wrote about traveling to the moon or under the sea before it ever happened. Or one of the most prolific authors of all time, Isaac Asimov, who's also considered to be one of the greatest science fiction authors ever. In his Robot series, he attempted to lay out a philosophical and moral framework for ensuring robots serve humanity, guarding against their becoming our destructive overlords. Speaking of robots, in the last decade we've seen many advances in the field of robotics. Here's a short clip of what the robots from Boston Dynamics, Petman, and Big Dog look like now. And we have to give a shout out to many of the other sci-fi greats. And I also have to mention the space elevator, which won't be science fiction for too much longer. And we can't leave out Star Trek. 3D printers, anyone? Or any of the countless other inventions that were first dreamt of and considered science fiction, but have become reality. Fiction can inspire scientists and inventors to create or invent the future. And while science fiction sometimes has a way of preceding reality, it also has a way of warning us of what's to come, to anticipate and explore the human consequences of new technologies, laws, and social transformations. Right now, with so many of the things that we took for granted up for grabs, businesses are facing a new industrial revolution that will create new fortunes and destroy others. Tech-enabled business models like gig-centered companies are changing how people work in unexpected ways. And what about the changes we've already seen in education technology? There are many ways to look back through time at how edtech has developed throughout the years. And we can also look specifically about certain types of education technology, such as the history of e-learning or distance learning or online learning, whichever you want to call it. Just the last 20 years of how the World Wide Web alone has impacted the edtech world is significant. This timeline is a visual representation of an EDUCAUSE article by Martin Weller that looks at some of the specific technologies we've seen develop over the last 20 years. These are just the top hits. How many have you used in your classroom? He also makes several points about this overview that we should consider when trying to understand what's coming in the next 20 years of technology. I highly recommend that you take a look at the article, and I'll also be providing you with additional resources to check out. We have to look back and discuss one more critical topic before we can move on to the reports themselves and the trends. I'm not going to discuss this at length. I've given a 2-part talk on the internet and the World Wide Web before, and I'll be giving an updated version soon. But we have to reflect on a couple of things. In those dark days before the internet, life was so much better. Well, maybe not always better, but things were definitely slower and more simple. We're only at the start of a new information age. All of the tools that we use on the web have not really been around that long. The World Wide Web, which is what we really mean to say when we use the word internet, has only been around since the early 90s. I graduated high school in '94. We only had one computer hooked up. Nobody really understood what that meant. Since that time, we've gone from the read-only web, where you had to know code called HTML or hypertext markup language in order to share information from one computer to another. And then in the 2000s, with the start of the social web, where people would be able to share content and information and interact with others without having to know any programming or code. And now we've seen the web evolve to the semantic age with connected intelligence. For example, if you have Alexa or Google Assistant at home, you enable routines or skills for these smart devices to perform, like asking, "Alexa, do I need an umbrella today?" Things like social bookmarking, YouTube, Wikipedia, blogging have been around now for about 10-15 years, but in the greater scheme of things, that's like no time at all to be dealing with so many very new ideas. We could get a lot more granular, but I'll save it for the next time. But we should consider that we're on the cusp of entering a new phase of the web. Many have speculated what that will look like, but no matter what trends we see in the next decade or further out in the future, one thing is certain: it will have a profound effect on education and society. As pioneers, we should cut ourselves a little slack and remember to have fun exploring new territory and not worry about being instant technological experts. But we should also set aside time to learn about how we can apply these new technologies in the classroom. How are we doing? Still with me? I know it's a lot to think about, but it's really important to have a basic understanding of how fast change is really happening and what's in play before we get to what's coming. Just a little more background, I promise. When I had given my first Tech Trends talk in 2013, I had mainly looked at the New Media Consortium's Horizon Report and discussed 10 of the top trends. The New Media Consortium was founded in the early 90s and was known as a leader in the inventive application of technology to overcome challenges in teaching, learning, and creative expression. And their Horizon Report grew into a focused-looking, ongoing research project. Recently, the New Media Consortium and all of their assets were acquired by EDUCAUSE, which is, of course, one of the largest higher ed organizations, and Fordham is a member of. Since that time, we've added things like flipped classroom, mobile computing to some of the tech shops we've offered. We've also given presentations on augmented reality, hosted discussion groups on the history and future of higher education MOOC, and have collaborated with faculty and IT staff on related topics. We've also made 3D printing available to the university. In fact, I want to mention that IT has been working with the library to launch an innovative space up at Rose Hill. Part of that space will be dedicated to a makerspace with 3D printing. This space will be open to all, regardless of whether you are staff or student, science or creative writing major. We have more information available on our website and would be delighted to speak with you if you have any questions or ideas. The pilot is still in the planning phase, so we welcome all input. EDUCAUSE publishes a yearly list of key issues in teaching and learning. Here are a couple of key points. Accessibility and universal design jumped from the 12th place in 2015 to 2nd place on the list in 2018, and it's now 5th on the list for 2019. Most of the advice for IT leaders in this area has focused on accessibility, making sure systems and tools meet the legal requirements for serving users with disability barriers. Accessibility is one of the 3 main initiatives in the strategic planning for the Instructional Technology Academic Computing branch of IT. We will be having more workshops throughout the upcoming year and breakout sessions at Faculty Technology Day. There are also different tools that are available to faculty, and our office is providing training and support. I'm going to mention those, but we don't have time to delve into specifics today, so I would urge you to attend one of the breakout sections or contact us. This time around, instead of looking at just one report that focused on higher ed, I wanted to look at what was happening in the broader context. Not only because if you're looking at the future through a small pinhole, you'll miss things, but also because I think that more than ever, we can see how the shifts in technology have caused radical culture, financial, political changes, which all certainly have an effect on education. I mentioned Amy Webb before. She's also the author of The Signals Are Talking and The Big Nine, which focuses on the future of AI. I have both of these books if you want to stop by and take a look. I've sorted this year's trends into 20 main categories. Clearly, we don't have time to discuss all of these trends, but I'll make a couple of summarizing remarks on these when we discuss the trends. I also have to mention Gartner, which is a global research and advisory firm that provides insights, advice, and tools for IT, finance, HR, customer service, and other industries. You're probably familiar with their hype cycles, which show the stages of maturity, adoption, and social application for new technology. This year, these are their top 10 strategic trends. We'll be discussing a few of these in more detail in a bit. I'm not going to be able to get a chance to discuss much from Mary Meeker's annual Internet Trends Report. The most current one just came out in March, but I had to include it on the list. Mary Meeker is a venture capitalist and former Wall Street securities analyst. Back in '95, she was an analyst at Morgan Stanley. She's now at Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield & Byers. She foresaw how a wave of unprecedented innovation was going to change lives and create enormous wealth. She summarized her views in a landmark report that instantly secured her reputation as the Nostradamus of technology. Every year she delivers her information bomb report. The reports aren't just for investors, though. You'll find the latest data on all things internet in this report and its effect on broader technological and cultural shifts. We won't get a chance to discuss much from the J.W. Thompson Intelligence Report either, but I wanted to give it a mention for those of you who want to go through the reports after the session. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go through everything, but let's examine some of the trends, and we'll start with looking at 3D technologies. Remember when this came out in 2008? Yeah, 10 years later, and 21, soon to be 22 movies, with Endgame coming out later this month. Augmented reality we saw doesn't seem to be cutting edge anymore, but considering what goes into the development of that type of technology in real life, this technology is still very experimental.
We can literally show you what's happening with the body.
We can look at how the heart moves, or look at how the brain.
This is a clip of Microsoft HoloLens, what AR could look like in the education sphere.
And hear the sounds. How the diaphragm moves, when the lungs move. A click of the fingers is going to allow students to see how everything's interconnected in the body.
We have means to draw people's attention to things to get them where they need to look. Do you want to look and then pull the bones out?
So what exactly do we mean by AR, MR, VR? A lot of initials. Wired did a feature a while ago on Magic Leap that did a great job of not just explaining the difference and what these things mean, but sharing a little bit about the history of these related technologies. Augmented reality is interacting with the real world around you while there's a simulation overlaid on top of what you see. Virtual reality is interacting with a real world but inside of a simulation. And mixed reality is a blending of both of these worlds in which the physical and digital can interact. Instead of the Internet of Information, consider it the Internet of Experience. By the way, the author of that piece, Kevin Kelly, is best described as a digital visionary. You might be familiar with the magazine he co-founded called Wired. EDUCAUSE has published one of their 7 things you should know about AR, VR, MR, with more details about what it is and how it works. From their latest campus survey, the most popular VR set is the Samsung Gear. I brought mine in if you'd like to take a look at it, download an app and give it a go. Both the Samsung Gear and Google's Daydream rely on smartphones. While that offers convenience and low cost, the trade-off is that you'll find lower resolution graphics on them than what you'll see on something like the Oculus Rift or the HTC Vive. Although, anecdotally, I'll tell you that when my mom gave it a go after I set it up for her with an app that let her walk with the penguins, she immediately started moving around and reaching out, trying to touch them. So when we say lower graphics, they're still pretty advanced to something that you would see like what was in Second Life back when it was launched in 2003. Speaking of Second Life, which is a virtual reality technology, in 2016, I sat in on a couple of Lori Goldkind's class, Technology and Social Work Practice. In one class, students Skyped with a therapist who talked about the use of Second Life in therapy. In one example, she spoke about the difference and impact on this patient's rehabilitation and learning to adjust to using a prosthesis between using an avatar in Second Life and watching videos. Second Life had more of an impact because of the way the patient viewed the avatar as an extension of themselves, as opposed to watching someone else demonstrate an action or skill. They had to articulate each of the steps in the process to replicate it virtually, instead of passively watching the process of somebody else doing it. In another class, students downloaded some of the virtual reality apps for Google Cardboard to test out and then discuss. They took a look at one of the films that was made in collaboration with the UN as part of a wider challenge to combat donor fatigue for humanity's biggest challenges. Unlike photo essays and documentary films, in VR you are forced to twist and turn your head to take everything in. You aren't seeing the environment, you are in the environment. If you have headphones on, it even sounds like you're there. You're sharing a moment in time and a connection in a way that is truly extraordinary. The students shared their thoughts on the experience and were inspired by feelings of empathy that the tech was able to convey. EDUCAUSE, and HP's Campus of the Future project, explores the efforts of 11 colleges and universities to investigate the ways that augmented reality, virtual reality, and 3D scanning and printing technologies can benefit teaching, learning, and research. In this study, researchers explored the ability of extended reality technologies to enhance educational experience, including participation in collaborative simulations of real-world challenges, exploration of historical sites, audio simulations to improve the ease of hearing aid adjustments, and using AR overlays to increase understanding and capacity in participatory activities. It was guided by these two questions. What educational activities lend themselves to the use of 3D technologies, and what are the most effective 3D technologies for the various learning goals? Their key findings were recreating historical spaces that are difficult or impossible to visit, building models of contemporary environments that can be easily manipulated, looking beneath the veneer of a structure to understand its construction, developing anatomy simulations to understand the spatial and functional relationships of organs and cells, using overlays of existing processes to reveal or illustrate things that we simply cannot observe, touring the insides of a cell to identify and understand the functions of its components, touring structures, sites, and cities that are too large, delicate, or remote to visit in real life, or designing, manipulating, and revising virtual objects that would otherwise be too expensive in analog form. Here's a snapshot from what some of the students from Yale who participated in the Reality Virtually Hackathon at the MIT Media Lab in January had to say. We wanted to create an experience that destigmatized mental health, an experience that allowed people to quite literally express, touch, feel, pop, hug, and throw their feelings, the good and the bad. In the future, I want to make a form collective. Every user who experiences form can leave their feelings out there in the space for future users to engage with. With hundreds of particles of all sorts of colors and properties sticking to the surfaces from all sorts of people, the experience forms an art piece that is the universal amygdala. I mentioned light before. Part of that space will be dedicated to exploring and creating AR, VR, and MR experiences. Our next trend and focus is AI. Remember when we mentioned the rate of accelerating returns? Well, hold on to your hats, because when we talk about AI, we'll really see things speeding up. The first work that is generally recognized as AI was McCullough and Pitt's 1943 formal design for Turing-complete artificial neurons. There are so many different facets of AI, but let's take a look at a couple. One of the most worrying problems in AI is the hidden bias. It's a very complex problem. There are almost 200 different cognitive biases to consider when coding and designing AI.
Each and every day to make countless decisions for us. Despite their seemingly neutral mathematical nature, algorithms, however, aren't necessarily any more objective than humans, because at the end of the day, they are written by people. And this is where the phenomenon of algorithmic bias comes into play. It has many examples. Like when Nikon cameras equipped with the blink detection feature wouldn't snap photos of many of its Asian users because the software thought their eyes were never open. Or how Amazon's Alexa struggles to recognize different accents, and when Google Translate insistently associates certain jobs with certain genders, while translating sentences with gender-neutral pronouns from languages like Turkish, Finnish, and Chinese. In 2015, Google's photo recognition tool mistakenly tagged a photo of two black people as gorillas. Meanwhile, in the US, a crime-predicting algorithm wrongly labelled black people reoffenders, at nearly twice the rate of white people.
And now that industries and government agencies are implementing AI, the issue is very troubling because it's affecting real people. And that's not the only problem area when it comes to AI. AI is still very nascent technology, and it is a critical time. Think about this. When Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web, his goal was to freely share scholarly information with other scientists around the world. 30 years later, the World Wide Web has progressed far beyond a simple communication tool and has had a profound effect on virtually every facet of society. These are just some of the difficult issues people are still trying to figure out and address. Let me follow up from this quote by sharing this thought. Remember that book title I showed you earlier? Well, the future of AI, and by extension, the future of humanity, is controlled by 9 companies. Amy says that are developing the frameworks, chipworks, networks, that are funding the majority of the research, that are earning the lion's shares of the patents, and in the process mining our data in ways that aren't transparent or observable to us. 6 of them are in the US, and she refers to them as the G Mafia: Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, IBM, and Apple. And then 3 are in China, and they are the bad: Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Speaking of China, there is an article from Technology Review that highlights some of the important things that one of the leading researchers at the University of Oxford, who studies China's AI development, has shared about the current state of the industry. The Chinese and English-speaking AI communities have an asymmetrical understanding of each other. Because most Chinese researchers can read English, but English-speaking researchers cannot read Chinese, the Chinese research community has a deeper understanding of what's happening on both sides of the globe. Westerners have a hyped-up view of China's AI capabilities. Chinese government sees AI as a tool for social governance. I'm sure you've read some of the articles talking about how facial recognition to name minor offenders, setting up social credit system, and other articles. AI research have benefited greatly from the China-US collaboration. And Chinese people care about AI ethics. It's not all doom and gloom, but let's take a look at some of the shifts, positive and negative, that are happening. There are 2 types of digital divides occurring today. The geographic divide, in which rural and other areas are underserved because it doesn't make financial sense for companies to invest in their infrastructure. And the economic divide, where infrastructure is in place, but lower income families lack affordable access and devices. These divides are colliding and combining in troubling ways, creating a whole spectrum of education, information, and privacy inequality. We're already seeing effects of this in regards to climate change and other issues. Lawmakers and policymakers don't understand the technology and are not prepared to deal with the ethics, privacy, and concerns that citizens are dealing with. When it comes to societal issues of mental health, isolation, cyberbullying, privacy concerns, ethics, net neutrality, we are at a critical tipping point. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple predictions. Up until this point, we've mostly focused on what trends we're observing today and the near future. So let's take a look at some predictions that might be a safe bet, but might also be a little bit wild. I included this because I really liked how they focused more on possible predictions extrapolated from past and current trends. On the website, you can adjust the slider to move forward in time to explore the state of technology in different years and decades. Obviously, the further out you go, the more speculative it becomes, but their ideas come from looking at the intersection of different disciplines, which means they have some very interesting ideas to consider. Next, I'd like to show a clip from Nicholas Negroponte's latest TED Talk. Negroponte is the founder of the MIT Media Lab. You might also know him from the One Laptop, One Child initiative. He gave one of the first TED Talks, which began in 1984, with 5 predictions for the future. And then from his last talk, he looks at that history of future predictions and also makes another for the next 30 years.
Thank you for asking.
In a sentence
I'll tell you what my prediction is. And my prediction, and this is a prediction, because it'll be 30 years, I won't be here. But one of the things about learning how to read, we have been doing a lot of consuming of information, learning through our eyes, and so it may be a very inefficient channel. So my prediction is that we are going to ingest information. You're going to swallow a pill and know English. You're going to swallow a pill and know Shakespeare. And the way to do it is through the bloodstream. So once it's in your bloodstream, it basically goes through it and gets into the brain, and when it knows that it's in the brain in the different pieces, it deposits it in the right places. So it's ingesting.
In my final thoughts, I want to go back to this graphic and the idea of being at the start of a new information age. The amount of knowledge and rate of transfer is increasing, and this is only going to amplify the amount of convergence we see in technology. When it comes to AI, the importance of getting it right is only going to be increasingly important as the amount of information and data we're creating grows. Stay tuned for a follow-up session on that. Finally, I want to end with this slide. I think it really sums up the challenge that we face in an era of such unprecedented change. Yes, STEM is important, but a humanities education is even more important. As a Jesuit school, I think we are uniquely positioned to be at the forefront of this and consider how to best balance the use of technology with the values of human interaction.